Good afternoon. My name is Bob Garrity and I'm the University Librarian at Monash University, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to this special event. I would like to start by acknowledging the people of the Kulin Nations on whose land I'm broadcasting from today. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And with many of us joining from multiple locations, I also pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land from wherever you may be joining us today. This event celebrates our newest exhibition, The Perfect Migrant, at the gallery in the Sir Louis Matheson Library, Clayton campus. The exhibition explores the emotional and artistic journey of people who have come to Australia as forced migrants or refugees. The Perfect Migrant draws inspiration from the artworks of visual artist, sculptor, and Dunera internee Erwin Fabian, and explores his creative and emotional response to the forced migration. It also offers glimpses into the journeys of other Dunera internees, as well as the journeys of contemporary Australian refugee artists as they respond to their own experiences of forced migration. I'd like to hand over now to the curator of the exhibition, Dr. Anne Holloway, Manager of Special Collections, Monash University Library.
Greetings, hello, just one moment here. Welcome, thank you everybody for coming. I'm just going to do some housekeeping first of all. What we're going to do is have questions and answers at the end of today's session. So if you can hold on to those or put them into the chat if you feel comfortable doing that, then we will address them in about 3/4 of an hour. Today we have here Jennifer Nadel, Karin Altmann, and Professor Justin Zobel, and the facilitator for today is not actually me, it is Professor Christina Twomey from Monash University. And I would just like to introduce her quickly first. So Christina is Professor of History at Monash University, and since 2017 she has been the head of the School of Philosophical, Historical and International Studies. She's the elected fellow of the Australian Academy of Humanities and the Academy of Social Sciences. And in 2012, she was Distinguished Visiting Chair of Australian Studies at the University of Copenhagen. In 2018, a visiting professor at Kyushu University, and is a member by ministerial invitation of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade Editorial Advisory Board, and the Australian representative International Committee of Historians Without Borders. All that said, her own research focuses on the social and cultural history of war, with particular interest in imprisonment and internment, humanitarian aid programs, and the Australian Asian region, as well as relations to gender and welfare, which intersects beautifully, of course, with today's topic, looking at life after internment. And her research has also had crossover with stories of those who came out from the Queen Mary and the Dunera. So I'll stop talking now and hand this over to Christina, who shall start the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anne, for that very generous introduction. And just before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you today from the lands of the Wurundjeri people, and to also pay my respects to elders past and present, and elders of any other community who might be with us today in this session. I'm delighted to be part of this gathering, which brings together three people with family connections to the Dunera. For those of you who are unaware of what the Dunera was or what the connection is, the Dunera was a ship that departed the UK in July 1940. It was peopled with men who had been resident in Britain, but were originally from Germany and Austria, who were deported to Australia, where they were interned for the duration of the war. Most of the men were Jewish, and many of them had fled Hitler's Reich as refugees. And these are men who are now most commonly known as the Dunera Boys. And our speakers today all have a personal connection to that story. And I'm going to begin by inviting them each to outline exactly what their personal connection to that story is. So the first person I'm going to invite is Karin Altmann, who is an award-winning screenwriter, documentary maker, and script consultant. But I'm going to let her, in her own words, describe for us what her connection to the Dunera story is. Welcome to you, Karin.
Thank you. My father was on the Dunera, but he was not Jewish. He was a communist, and had been running in the streets fighting the Nazis since the early 30s. He'd already been in Estebaden camp. And when he escaped to London, when they collared the lot, of course, he was on the Dunera. He loved his experience in Australia. When I finally met him later in life, one of his opening words to me were, "Oh, you bloody bastards," in a kind of mangled Australian German accent. Like many of the Dunera boys, he actually returned to Germany after the war, in his case to build socialism, followed closely by my mother, who was a Jewish refugee who had been saved by the Australians, thank you. And I ended up in Australia because for her socialism failed, the marriage failed, and she and I returned here. So his story and what I learned about him happened much, much later in my life.
Thank you very much, Karin. Our next panellist is Jennifer Nadel, who's a barrister and award-winning journalist and writer and co-founder of the Compassion in Politics think tank. And Jennifer is in fact zooming in to us from the United States today. So welcome, Jennifer.
Thank you so much, and apologies for my background. I'm on a remote island off the coast of Maine, so it's rather dark and late here, but it's very moving to be with you all. And my connection is my father was on the Dunera. I didn't know that until shortly before he died. I had no idea he was Jewish. I had had no idea of his wartime experience. He was an historian, and yet he didn't tell us our own history. So ironically, it's only been after his death that I have begun the journey of learning about the Dunera, and really a lot of the puzzles about my father beginning to make sense as I discovered what those wartime experiences he'd been through were. He'd escaped from Vienna on the Kindertransport, the train that was arranged voluntarily and saved the lives of 10,000 Jewish children. He got on the train without his parents or his one sibling and left them behind. He arrived in England, was taken in by a kind headmaster, learnt English very quickly, learnt English with a very English accent, and begun to really enjoy school. And then the knock on the door came, the British police arrived, he was interned as an enemy alien and then deported on the Dunera to Australia. And, you know, thanks to what happened after the war, he was given the chance to go to university, and he ended up teaching at Harvard, studying at Harvard, and starting a historical journal, History and Theory, but his family didn't know his history. So that's why I'm here today.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. And the last panellist we have is Professor Justin Zobel, who's Pro Vice Chancellor Graduate and International Research at the University of Melbourne. And I invite Justin now to introduce himself and outline his connection to the Dunera story. Welcome, Justin.
Thank you, Christina. My connection is that my stepfather was a Dunera boy. He had been brought up in Berlin in a household of his father, a successful businessman, but with the closure of schools to Jews, he had gone to Britain in 1938 as a farm worker, and in 1940 was given the chance to move to a more remote area of Britain or be deported to Australia on the Dunera, and chose the Dunera, I think calculating, as many people did, including the Prime Minister at the time, that England was at severe risk itself of being Nazified. He returned, he arrived in Australia, he spent 2 years in the camps, and I know we'll discuss this. This was an absolutely life-defining experience being interned here in Australia, but returned to the UK, and where his career reflects the sort of intellectual disruption, I think, that the camps exposed him to. He was first an Anglican minister, having been raised a secular Jew. This transitioned into him becoming a Guardian columnist and quite well-selling book author, to becoming somebody who worked for the BBC, on a documentary or two, completing a PhD. And then we all migrated, after he met my mother in the mid-60s, we all migrated in the early 70s to Australia, where he saw out his career as an academic. And that's my connection.
Thank you very much. And I think you can all see just through those very brief introductions from our speakers of the incredibly diverse range of experiences that the connection to Dunera, in fact, seeded. What I'd like to do now is to invite our panellists to comment on how their relatives remembered the experience of internment, because sorry, I just saw a question in the chat that I will respond to in a minute, because you can see from the descriptions that were provided, in one respect, these three men were refugees from Nazi Germany. In another, they then become internees in Australia. So there's this sort of duality of identity, and it also then seeds a relationship to Australia. So I'd like to invite each of our speakers to comment on how that experience of being interned in Australia was remembered and reflected upon by their relatives throughout the course of their life. I'll invite Karin to respond first.
I got the impression that my father rather enjoyed his time in Australia. It meant that he could be an active political operative in the camp, and there was a camp parliament, and I understand from several people that he was quite powerful in that. And also he was older, so the camp members, as it were, looked up to him, and he did learn to speak English with this sort of broad, mangled German Australian accent. What he was particularly proud of was his Australian service badge, because of course, when they were released, they were allowed to go into the Labour Force, 8th Labour Company, I think. So he was immensely entertained by the fact that he had served in the Australian Army, even though at the time that he and I were having the conversation, he was a heavyweight political operative in East Germany.
Thank you, Karin. Now I'll invite Jennifer to comment on that same issue of, I mean, Jennifer, you explained that your father didn't really talk much about his experience prior to the very end of his life, but did he make any comment on it then to you about what it had meant to him?
No, he didn't even tell me directly that that had been his experience. And so I began to piece together the pieces afterwards. I know from my mother, he took my mother to Australia and introduced her to many of the people that he'd met while he was interned. And she said there was an incredible warmth between them all and enormous fondness. And my father talked about his experiences and what he'd learnt, and he was an incredibly well-educated man, and he arrived in that camp as a 16-year-old boy, and he left with a breadth and depth of education that he would never have got in a regular school. He was incredibly, unlucky to have had that experience, but also incredibly privileged to have had that time with so many of the brightest and most gifted intellectuals of that era. So it had a huge impact on his life. And it's interesting that two of the three of us have parents who became academics, and Karin's father also took a very intellectual route. So it's clearly that there was something very fertile artistically and intellectually that happened in that camp.
Thank you, Jennifer. And now I'll invite Justin to comment on that same issue of how the internment experience refracted throughout the rest of his life.
My answer is going to be disturbingly close to Jennifer's, I think. And I sort of go back to what I know of his life before the war, living in having moved down from a grand house in Berlin to a dingy apartment with sort of 1 bedroom or 2 bedroom tiny apartment, then to be a farm worker, working on a pig farm of all things in Britain, to suddenly find himself thrust into this extraordinary intellectual company that was represented in the camps. And though he did go on to study theology in the UK afterwards, I'm sure that degree was no match, and the learnings from that actual university degree no match from his learnings in the camp. And it shaped his whole life. His whole outlook, right to the end, was formed by his determination to help people to think. And that was very much something he'd taken away from that intellectual climate.
Thank you. So I think from those three responses, we can also see there's elements of similarity, but there's also people for whom having been in a camp remained a big presence in their life. And for others, it became this absence to be papered over or to not be discussed. So I wonder now if we can talk a little more about how the knowledge of these internment experiences refracted throughout the family. How did it come to be discussed? How did it influence the sorts of things that happened inside the family? Maybe I'll go to you first, Justin, because we had a bit of a conversation about this yesterday.
I mean, it was such a, there are many threads to this. I mean, the first one is one I just touched on, which is that there was an incredibly intense intellectual atmosphere in the home throughout my childhood and adulthood. Everything was argued, and you could perhaps say that that's, you know, an attribute of Jewish scholarship in general, but it was very, very intense. Another one was what we'll call it, I was trying to pronounce correctly yesterday, is the asceticism. And I'm going to share a picture, if I might, as we discussed yesterday. This is his study when we lived in suburban Melbourne. And what you can see there is a sort of ordinary room. But what I'm going to point at is that there was no heating and no cooling. The windows are open. In fact, they can't be closed. And I had this tremendous shock of recognition because, of course, at Tatura, there's a wonderful museum of the Dunera. And in that museum is a reconstructed hut showing how the internees lived. And here was this study, almost a model of the huts. It even had at times a camp bed in it. I mean, it was, so his life had been, the desire he had was to continue to live the way that he had learned. And this continued, I mean, throughout our childhood. Unnecessary things like a second pair of shoes, unnecessary things like fresh food for dinner when there was leftovers from the weekend. These were frills that we just sort of didn't need in our lives. And so that the possibility of living simply but very happily, I think, made a very, very deep impression. So there are some more negative things as well, which we might get to later, but there's no doubt that he brought that sort of the culture of support and learning from the camps, but also from sort of minimalism of what matters in life very much through our lives when we were growing up.
Thank you, Justin. Jennifer, I wonder if there's anything there that you would like to respond to or comment upon. I know you explained that your father never discussed it overtly with you. Now that, as an adult looking back on your childhood, do you feel like you can see any manifestation of some of the sorts of patterns that Justin's talking about in your home, or was it quite different?
Well, it was actually uncanny, Justin, when you showed that picture of your father's study, because my father spent all my childhood in a study. He had a study, and that's where he went, and we as children weren't allowed to enter. And I used to think that was a very cruel injustice, although I now have a study of my own and completely understand why he might not want 3 young daughters cavorting through it. But the intellectual life was absolutely what dominated us. And there was kind of an assumption that we would just be brilliant, you know, that there was no allowance made for us being anything other than that. And it put quite a lot of pressure on us. I mean, he spoke at least 5 languages, and, you know, it was always a complete puzzlement to him that I didn't read ancient Greek and my Latin was poor and I couldn't speak a word of German, you know, that was just, he really couldn't understand how that had happened to his children, that they hadn't innately got the ability to do that. And the other thing I just wanted to pick up on what you said was that your father trained to be an Anglican minister, and my father was baptized a Christian, and I'm just curious, sorry, I know Christina you're asking the questions, but I'm just curious as to whether part of the drive for that was just to shake off the Jewishness, because my father certainly did not want to be perceived or known as Jewish. As far as I can gather, he believed that left us in grave danger. So, you know, part of my understanding of why he didn't tell us, or even my mother, his wife, that he was Jewish, was that it was something he associated with extermination, and so wouldn't want us to be at risk if the same thing happened again. So I was just curious that your father also took.
I'll answer that, and I'll try not to be too wordy. So my biological father was also a Jewish refugee. He was interned in Canada, which is a very different story and very different camp, because the Jews were housed with Nazis in the prison there. But my father completely disavowed his Jewishness. No connection at all. For my stepfather, it wasn't that at all. It was that as a teenager at great risk, and perhaps slightly aligned with the story of Karin's father, who was a bit older, he had already been a communist. And the Bibles were scattered through the camp in Chatura, and he read the New Testament as a primitive socialist text, you know, meekness, equality, and that he preached that in lectures and in the pulpit and so on, right to the very end of his life. So no, there was no rejection of Jewishness, but it was an embrace of Christianity as a foundation of communism.
I think that's quite a nice link to the experience of Karin's father, who did spend the rest of his life as a committed communist. I wonder, can you speak to that point a little, Karin?
Yes, I can. He returned to Germany absolutely determined to remake the East German state. His major role, as I discovered all of this, of course, much later, his major role was in an organization called the Afro-Asian Friendly Society, a name straight out of the John le Carré playbook. And in fact, the function of this organization was to promote national insurrection in Africa. So I think he was based in Egypt, but he was spending time with Nkrumah and with Yasser Arafat and any leader who was prepared to overthrow the colonial wake. So he pointed to me very proudly one day to a kind of chief's club, which was on his wall. He said, "I've been declared a chief." And, you know, this man was maybe 5'3" tall and kind of stocky and had this rather voice, a fine sense of humor and a great sense of theater, but clearly extremely effective in terms of the work that he was doing in fomenting those revolutions. And I think he remained completely and utterly committed to communism until the couple of days before he died, just before the Berlin Wall fell, and he apparently said to his stepson, with whom I am now very friendly, "You can't imprison a whole people." And that was the extent of him disavowing.
And Karin, do you think the commitment to communism was something that came out of his experience in the camp, or it was there before he was interned?
His experience of communism began very, very early.
Right. Very
early. He was running in the streets against the brown shirts from the time that he was a teenager.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Oops. If I can throw to you again, Jennifer, I wonder if you can comment, was there any overtly political activity in your father's life that you feel like you can trace to this experience of being a refugee or an internee?
Well, though, rather, no. I mean, I would kind of feel very proud if he'd been a communist like the other two fathers. He became, if you like, the perfect migrant. So he didn't want to stick out. He didn't want to cause trouble. He was terrified of authority. He was terrified of making a fuss. He just wanted to blend, be part of, and just not be noticed. So he took the opposite route, which was to assimilate, so that there was no trace of his Jewishness, so he thought, left on the record.
And once you discovered in later life the extent of your father's experiences and his Jewishness and his former identity as a refugee, did any of that knowledge then help you rethink certain things about your childhood? Did it force you to rethink the family or the experiences that the family had? How did it change what you thought about your own experience of growing up in that household?
It was not an easy household to grow up in. My father was very strict. The house was separated. Children were on one side, he was in the other, and we weren't really very interesting. And we had certain rules which definitely throw back to his status as you know, someone who was trying to cover his tracks. We were never allowed to ask questions. So that meant that I didn't know anything. And the moment I'd ask him to tell me a story about when he was little, he'd say when I was a little girl, and I'd know that it was all going to be made up. I mean, he did tell us the most fantastic made up stories, but he told us not one fact about his childhood, and he forbade us to talk to anyone outside of the home about anything. He didn't really like us having visitors over, and he certainly didn't want our family in any way to be talked about. We grew up with 3 German Shepherd Alsatian dogs, and he convinced us all that they were trained to kill, and I realize, you know, now latterly that was to try and keep people away from us, to make people scared of coming anywhere near our home. But I think what discovering, you know, his true origin has done is it's made emotional sense of a lot of the experiences I've had. I grew up with a lot of fear. I have always had this thing that I need to be able to leave. I've had, you know, multiple bank accounts from the days I first left home as a student, not with any significant sums of money in, but just little things squirreled away. I've had a fear of being trapped, locked in anywhere, and I didn't know where that fear came from. And so now that I know, although I have to say that deciding to speak publicly about his Jewishness and my own as a result, I had to overcome a huge amount of fear, because he had schooled me to be terrified of that, you know, subliminally. And so when I first decided to speak out about his story and my story, which was when anti-Semitism started to rise in the UK, I felt I had this huge psychological backlash of, what are you doing? I felt like I was going to be met with a firing squad when I stood out publicly and started talking about it. And of course that wasn't the case, but I guess I felt a disloyalty that he had done so much to protect me, and here I was blowing my cover in his posthumously.
Thank you. And before I ask Justin and Karin to respond to what you've just said, I also wanted to acknowledge for the people attending how emotional and how exposing it is for people to participate in a panel like this. And I just wanted to say how much I respect and admire the 3 of you for being able to speak like this and to have the courage to speak out, because I can tell in the tone of your voice how very close to the bone it is. So I feel very privileged, and I'm sure those in attendance do too, to hear these stories. So thank you. Can I ask Justin and Karin if there's anything that Jennifer just said that resonates with you, or any aspects of it that you'd like to pick up and comment on?
I'm happy to go first.
Thanks, Justin.
I mean, our household was certainly not strict. We had absolutely wide open, anything goes childhood. The caftans ruled in the living room, and people came and went, and there could be strangers sleeping on the couch at just about any time. But some elements of what you say absolutely resonate. Sometimes I feel like I'm a member of Jews Anonymous, with a Jewish father, because it was a word I really struggled to say, partly I think because of Australian anti-Semitism that I was very aware of in secondary school more than in the home context. The thing I was really aware of and have recalibrated on and rejudged with understanding of the wartime experience was the anger, the sort of bottled rage that was in the household when I was a teenager. And it would come out at us having happy experiences. If we were happy, that was a problem, and I can now see that having a happy, well-tracked trajectory towards university and, job and house and kids was something that he'd been cut off from and he couldn't deal with. He had his sister survived. She was an Auschwitz survivor, and they met briefly in 1950 and then again in 1980. He was unable to talk to her. And I think, I've forgotten the timing, but either the Dunera Boys book or the TV show was a factor in that, because he suddenly had to face, this is actually what happened in my life. And with that, suddenly all scales are moved. We saw where the anger was coming from and the drivers that he had that were the things that he just hadn't confronted, and he became a better person. So Primo Levi famously committed suicide because of survivor guilt. That's happened to many others who are in that situation. Working through that situation and being able to come out the other side, I think, was a tremendous thing to be able to do. And I do think the camps were a big part of that, because they taught intellectual resilience that otherwise might not have been there.
Thank you. Karin, did you want to respond in any way?
I also had that experience because I grew up with my mother, who was a Jewish refugee, who largely kept the past secret, but also grew up with that sense of implicit resentment at the freedoms that I had and the education that I was getting. So that became a battleground. Subsequently, as I learned more and more about the fact that I was Jewish, I made a decision based largely on history and based largely on the fact that even if you hide it, they're going to find out who you are. So you may as well be who you are. So, I mean, I didn't become religious or any of those things, but I embraced it culturally. When my children were born, boys, I had them circumcised, and I insisted that they have a bar mitzvah. I didn't care if they became a Jedi Knight at the end of the process, but they should at least learn who the hell they are. But interestingly, when I went to see my father, I made some comment, very uncomfortable, polite chit-chat in those first meetings. And I said, I'm Jewish. And he turned around and snapped very hard, only half. So we had a debate about matrilineal inheritance, and he shut up. So a lot of it comes out of identity and the struggle to be who you are, usually in the context of some quite massive silences with which you grow up. So you fight your way through them to some kind of understanding of reality and truth. And then to understand, well, what is it you're going to make of this experience? And certainly one of the things that struck me, given what my father later told me, was if you compared what they had endured in Germany and then in London and then on that hell ship, And then in the kind of benignly ill-organized kind of Middle European university city they set up in the middle of Australia, it really told me a lot about the best things about Australia and Australians. And the hothouse that was created there certainly had the most amazing effect on this culture in terms of what it then unleashed into Australian culture after the war.
Can you talk a bit more about that, Karin? What it unleashed in the culture? How do you see that?
Well, there is this sort of wonderful list of extraordinary people who emerged from that experience. It wasn't just suddenly this amazing collection of gorgeous European men who kind of cruised into the dances in Melbourne. I mean, I imagine the Australian men who were at those dances were feeling terribly outclassed by these very soignés, glamorous fellows, most of whom could dance. But so there was that effect within the community at the time. But of course, then as they started to move out into the community, and you have photographers and furniture designers and professors of philosophy, I mean, it was probably one of the single greatest set of resources unleashed by way of migration, albeit forced migration, ever delivered to this country. And of course, the other way it worked was that there was also a very significant group of German left-wingers who then went back to Germany. And when I first went there to meet my father, he gathered them all up to meet me, because this was theatre. And they really were like, it was the editor of the newspaper in Berlin. I mean, all these kind of top dogs who were all chuckling and chortling about their experience in Hay. I mean, I think that they really remembered it with great affection, you know, even while denouncing capitalist pig bastards in roughly those terms.
Thank you. It's so interesting. I wonder if all of you could comment on that sort of the binary of affection for Australia and some of the negativity that we associate culturally with internment and internment camps and the whole question of displacement. How do you, for yourselves and in the lives of your relatives who were thus affected, how do you balance those two things, the affection and some of the more negative aspects of it? Justin, maybe I'll throw to you first.
This is a very abstract comment, I suppose, but something that is apparent even today visiting Tatura and the museum is that it was internment, but of a very open kind. There was integration with the community. The internees did some service in the community. They had friends in the community. They knew where they weren't. They knew what was happening in Germany, and they knew what their experience would have been in England. They as Germans, we moved to Australia in 1973, and immediately prior to that had been living in Sussex. It was not a comfortable place to be for a German, heavily German accented 50-year-old man to live at that time. Australia was completely open. We arrived at that time, and no one ever commented on how dark he was, because he was quite dark skinned. No one commented on the accent. It was just all part of the mix that we're so used to here. Although it's much later, I think it does go to that contrast that even internment in a casual mateship-based Australia was a very friendly place to be.
Jennifer, did you have anything you'd like to add there?
Yeah, I suppose that what we're really talking about is the silver lining of a cloud. And, you know, it's very moving, Karin, hearing your encounter with you know, your father's friends in Berlin. but you know, the emotional impact I know on my father, even of that benign internment in a non-hostile community, was really profound. And I've recently come across some of his letters and the notes he was trying to get through to his parents. Just, will I ever see you again? I'm scared. What's happening? You know, I don't have any money. I don't have any shoes. You know, all of those basic things. And I think because he was one of the youngest, he was 16. I think, you know, he was still more child than man. And as a result of that, it probably affected him differently. And he definitely struggled with depression for the whole of his adult life, and was, you know, a big supporter of voluntary euthanasia and, you know, exit and, you know, organizations that help people to take their own lives, and wanted the right to take his own life when living became too unbearable. So yeah, absolutely. When we look at, you know, what is happening in the world today, when we look at what internment looks like today, when we look at those heartbreaking scenes in Afghanistan today, the desperation to find safety, then my father, I'll speak for him, was lucky, but it doesn't mean that it wasn't, you know, incredibly, you know, psychically traumatic and damaging.
Exactly. And sorry, Justin.
I'll just make a very small note that many people won't be aware of, but there was a mail service from Tatura to Berlin. Letters got there and back. So although they were heavily censored, of course, the internees knew exactly what was going on back in Germany. So again, there was that pleasure of distance, I think, for not all the internees, obviously, but for very many of them.
Thank you. I want to allow enough time for questions. So I'm going to finish with a final question for each of our panellists. And the topic of today was life after internment. And we've been talking a lot about how that experience refracted throughout the lives of your relatives who had links to Dunera. And I just, as a final comment, wanted you to reflect on how that experience of being a refugee, being an internee, then impacted on you as people. Who are you in relation to this? How has it defined you in any way? Or is it something that you put at a distance? I just would like us to look at that intergenerational aspect just in a couple of concluding remarks from each of you. We'll start with you, Karin.
Again, the lack of experience in my growing up, of knowing about this and how I felt about it, limits my answer on this. But I subsequently learnt that my father had been in Esterwagen concentration camp before he escaped, and he would build chessmen out of bread, out of their rations. And when they were lined through the gauntlets to be beaten, he would put the chess board behind his shoulders to soften blows. So these were the kinds of lessons that I was learning as it went. But the other part of it is, because of the unique circumstances of my life, I actually came as a refugee. My mother and I returned, she for the second time, I for the first time. And the first day I landed here, I was 5. I went outside to play with the children who were in the street, and I promptly got beaten up for being German. So I walked back inside and I said, I am never going to speak German again. And I didn't. A decision I regret for the rest of my life. So I came with a profound sense of otherness anyway. So I understand in terms of my life as in terms of their life, how difficult it was to fit in and how much the desire to fit in existed. And I completely understood my mother's desire to abandon the past and fit in as best as she could. Because being a migrant is At best, it's an act of optimism. Sometimes it's force majeure. So it's absolutely about how do you survive this massive discombobulation of life as you know it. And we see that now in so many ways. And I won't even begin to talk about what's going on in Kabul.
It's a moment to be having this conversation when we're looking at those images of people just desperately trying to flee the Taliban.
It's absolutely, in my view, every immigrant is a fantastic asset for the country. They really do have something to deliver. From my uncle who started the commercial opal trade, to every person who is trying to get to this country has some kind of skill, and instead they're left to rot. And now they're abandoned to savages. And I'm in despair about the policies. And that, as it were, availability to despair, the imagination to see what that really feels like at a human level, I think is a direct result of the history of what has happened to our families, particularly my family, particularly the family that didn't survive in Europe, and indeed both from my mother and from my father, although he and I never agreed politically for 1 second.
Thank you, Karin. Justin?
The word otherness sums it up so well. I mean, there's a very standard pattern of migration, of the culture of migration, that you live in Australia and you become Australian, but you have a core within you that's that culture that you come from. And I don't have that core. I don't feel fully Australian. I have good memory of Britain, but I could not say, you know, that thing of being the refugee means that the culture that you might identify with, I'm not talking about myself, my stepfather, is kind of stripped away. He remained very German to the, you know, Hegel, Wagner, things you wouldn't expect a Jew to embrace strongly. But I think for us in my generation, there's very much a, first of all, there's that sort of detachment from of lack of identification, the otherness. The other thing I'd point out is I think, particularly for people who have that connection to the Holocaust, Trump was very horrifying in a way that he was not to the people around me, and although horrifying enough. And I am glad that my stepfather did not see that sort of change in the US in the last 6 years. He would have found that utterly destroying.
Thank you, Justin. And Jennifer, any final comment from you? Anything you'd like to comment on that we've talked about today?
I so identify with that otherness and that sense of deracination and not belonging, although I wasn't directly, you know, I was not the refugee myself. I've inherited, and something that Karin said earlier about we have to find out who we are and then own it fully. And I think the extent to which, you know, I was very depressed in my younger years, and the extent to which I have found myself and found the pieces of my father's story and been able to put them together is in direct correlation to how I have found myself, my voice, my truth, whatever it is. I can begin to own it, and that feeling of just not being part of anything, you know, being the child of a Dunera boy now is another identity I can have. And just, you know, it's definitely shaped my life. You know, I now run an organization called Compassion in Politics, and that was founded because in the UK, you know, we have refugees, as you do in Australia, drowning in the ocean to reach the safety of our shores. And I know for sure that if my father had tried to flee the Nazis as a child refugee, he wouldn't have reached the shores of England as he did. And so, you know, it falls to all of us to try and shift that attitude so that we can provide safety and welcome.
Thank you. We're going to open it up for questions now, and just while people put their questions in the Q&A chat, I wanted to thank you so much for a really wide-ranging and fascinating conversation. And I think the thing that jumps out to me is the number of visual images that came out of our verbal conversation. I can see the chessboard that Karin described and the German shepherds that you described, Jennifer, and the image of the study that Justin shared with us. So it was just an incredibly rich conversation that was so evocative of what it meant to grow up with people who had these experiences and how it refracted throughout your lives. So now I'll see if we have any questions that anybody would like to ask. There's one here from Steffi asking Jennifer if you've seen, I assume it's a film called The Last Goldfish. Have you seen that Jennifer?
I haven't, but I'm going to write that down.
Yes, I don't know. I don't know that film myself either, but it might be something for you to look up. No other questions as yet.
Does Steffi say why she's recommending the film?
No, she doesn't. Steffi, are you still there? I'm not sure that. Oh, Steffi is still there, and I think she's putting up her hand, but I think you need to type it in the question, Steffi. While we wait for questions from the audience, I'm just wondering, do you have any questions of each other? Seeing as you've not had the opportunity to meet in a room, is there anything that any of the other panelists said that sparked a question for you?
I had a question which kind of goes to when you said, how do you think it's affected you? I don't know how, I'm wondering whether my fellow panelists or sister panelists have had this experience of just having a drive that nothing's enough, like you've got to keep moving, you've got to keep pushing, you've got to keep creating. You know, I am not someone who has ever done enough. I don't know if that's, a common experience that you both have.
Absolute snap on that one. It's kind of an obsessive, whatever the task, obsessive desire to go deeper, to do better, to find a more coherent shape and form to it. And then, in my case, to find a way to communicate that to an audience.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm always busy. It's very hard to not be busy and to be pushing on to the next thing. And of course, sometimes that's a displacement activity because there are things you don't want to look at. But the business is that the busyness is absolutely there. And I also, Jennifer, share with you, I think, some of that instinct to safety, to nesting. And I dropped my background, to show that I've sort of got stuff around me, sort of reflects that sort of nesting instinct that I have. I'm in a very small room as well, that those shelves are just sort of half a meter behind me, but it's so true, such an echo of my response.
We've had a bit more information about the film that was mentioned. It's a film where a woman discovers her father's Jewishness late in life. He was interned by the British, and the film traces her exploration of his life and her discovery of her first family, and also a route back to the relatives who perished. So it sounds incredibly interesting. We have another question from the floor. Did the men have access to books in the camp? I think the answer to that is yes.
It became like a university. So it was...
my understanding was a rich array of books. Some of them brought them with them from England because they had some amount of luggage with them, and also books were not books sent up from one of the universities because of the eminence of the men who'd been interned.
And we've got time for one final question, which I have here. One of our participants is interested in the intergenerational impacts. What about your own children? How do they see these issues of identity? Anyone prepared to hazard a guess there?
I can join in on that one. I insisted my sons have their bar mitzvahs, and to my eternal relief, they became entirely irreligious thereafter. But what they have is a very, very profound and political sense of what it means to be a Jew in the modern world, and what indeed that meant at the time. Now, one of the ways that that works out in our family is in spectacularly black jokes. One of them is a cabaret performer working very much in the queer space, and he's very political about that. And one of the first jokes he ever made was, "I don't know how my two little Jewish parents popped out a 6'2" blonde who's practically Hitler's wet dream." And, you know, and he is. I mean, I blame the milkman, but that's another issue. So he does that very publicly. His other brother operates around that area in his work works in music in the UK. He's a specialist in opera. So he both observes, for instance, the rise of anti-Semitism in the UK with considerable alarm, but also finds so much of his work is now operating around the issues of diversity, of getting black singers, about getting trans singers. They both work very, very strongly in the whole area of the trans areas. So they have, in a way, transferred the sensibility of being Jewish in a hostile world into looking for other people operating in a hostile world and trying to find ways of assisting them.
Thank you, Karin. Justin?
I was going to make I mean, that was a very powerful observation. I can't possibly top that. I would say something that's my children are spread across their 20s, which is also the age group that I teach, of course, and work with as an academic. And something that strikes me about my children, I think, that I saw in my stepfather, was not just a very strong inner sense of values, which of course many young people have, but also a cool-headedness about it. You know, that it's not sort of abstracted from the world. They're very, they absolutely understand, you know, have internalized completely what their values actually mean, not in that sort of abstract, I want to abolish oil, or, you know, the sort of thing that young people who are very passionate will often want to do, but or want to abolish electricity or something, or get rid of private ownership or something. It's very grounded, but also very profoundly felt. And you know, not to boast about, you know, it's easy to boast about one's own children, of course, and I hope that's excusable, but I hope you understand what I'm saying.
Thank you, Justin. And Jennifer, we'll leave the last word to you.
I really relate to what Justin just said. My children have an extraordinary sense of values that goes far beyond what many of their friends have, and a willingness to stand up for them and an empathy for anyone who's experiencing suffering. And they also hold learning in esteem. Neither of them are academics, but, you know, the hallowed nature of books, the hallowed nature of music, the hallowed nature of those same things that were treasured in the camp have somehow filtered down to them. So it definitely hasn't left.
Well, thank you. You all sound like you're raising amazing people. And am I handing back over to you, Bob, at the end? I saw you.
You are, Christina.
Okay, before I do that, can I just say thank you so much? That was just an amazing conversation. I felt privileged to be able to be part of it. Back over to you, Bob.
Thanks very much, Christina. And likewise, I found it a really fascinating conversation. I really realize we've gone just a little bit over, but before we leave, I would just like to thank our panelists, Professor Justin Zobel, Karin Altmann, and Jennifer Nadel, our facilitator, Professor Christina Twomey, also Dr. Seamus Spark from the School of Philosophical, Historical, and International Studies, and Dr. Anne Holloway, manager of Monash University Library Special Collections, and also the library's communication teams for promoting and running the event. So on behalf of the library, thank you all for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.